The wind in this part of New Mexico territory didn't just blow, it scoured. It came down from the mountains with a sound like a sharpening knife, promising a winter that would take whatever was left. Clara Bell heard it every night. For 2 years, she had lived with that sound as her only steady companion. Her husband, a man whose hands were as heavy as his silences, had been dead that long. A wagon accident, they'd called it. A snapped axle on a steep grade. Clara called it breathing. She was alone on the homestead, a small patch of stubborn dirt 30 miles from the nearest town. The isolation was a physical weight. The land around her was high desert, unforgiving and vast, and November had come in early, biting and mean. The first snows had already dusted the pinon and juniper, leaving the ground hard as iron. Survival was a day-to-day calculation. The garden, her only real provision, had yielded its last. The root cellar held 2 bushels of potatoes, a small crate of turnips, and a dwindling supply of dried beans. Her bartering days were numbered. The last time she'd ridden into town, Mr. Hemlock at the Mercantile had barely looked at her. He'd taken the small bundle of dried sage and the 3 bars of lye soap she'd made, and given her half a sack of flour and a handful of salt in return. It was a thief's trade, but she'd taken it. The women were worse. They gathered their skirts when she passed, their whispers as sharp as the wind. Mrs. Davies, the banker's wife, had looked right through her, as if Clara were a pane of dirty glass. They had shunned her when her husband was alive, whispering about the bruises she tried to hide. They shunned her now that he was gone, whispering that she was unnatural, that she hadn't grieved properly, that she refused the decent proposals of remarriage from men who saw a free homestead and a warm body. She was a woman alone, in the 1870s, in this territory. That was a sin they could not forgive. The cold was making the animals bold. Coyotes yipped and howled from the ridges, their cries sounding closer each night. Hungry, worse. There were men, twice in the last week. She'd found tracks near the south line of her property. Not moccasins, heavy boots. Yesterday, she'd found the proof. 3 pinon trees cut down, the stumps still bleeding sap, the wood stolen, trespassers, squatters, maybe looking for an easy claim to jump. Clara kept her husband's old 12-gauge shotgun loaded and leaning by the door. She knew how to use it. She'd shot rattlesnakes and rabbits. She wondered if she could shoot a man. She feared she might have to. The storm hit just after dusk. It wasn't a gentle snow. It was a blizzard, a sudden wall of white that erased the world. The wind slammed against the small cabin, rattling the poorly fitted window frame. Clara stoked the fire in the small cast-iron stove, the cabin's only source of heat. She sat at the rough-hewn table, mending a tear in her last good wool blanket, her fingers stiff with cold. She ate a boiled potato for supper, chewing it slowly, trying to make it last. The loneliness was worst at night, in the storms. It was a hollow ache in her chest, a cold that the fire couldn't touch. Around 9 o'clock, she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a coyote. It was a heavy sliding thud against the cabin door. Clara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The trespassers? They'd come in the cover of the storm, thinking she was helpless. She moved silently. She put the blanket down, her hands shaking so hard she dropped her needle. She didn't stop to find it. She grabbed the shotgun. The metal was cold as ice. She cocked both hammers, the click-click sounding impossibly loud in the small room. "Who's out there?" she called, her voice tight. Only the wind answered, screaming around the eaves. Another sound, a groan, low and guttural. A thief wouldn't groan. A thief would be quiet, or he'd be breaking the door down. This was something else. This was pain. She stared at the door, at the thick wooden bar she'd set across it. Her mind raced. It could be a trick, a man pretending to be hurt, waiting for her to open it. She stood there for a full minute, the gun heavy in her arms, her breath clouding in front of her face. Then she heard a scratching, a desperate, weak sound, like an animal trying to dig its way in. God help me, she thought. She eased the shotgun onto the table, her hands still ready. She lifted the heavy bar. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it open against the inside wall. Snow and ice blasted into the room, extinguishing the single lantern on the table, plunging the cabin into near darkness, lit only by the orange glow of the stove. She didn't see him at first. She saw a shape, a mound of snow at her feet. Then the shape moved. He was massive. A man, half frozen, collapsed on his face on her doorstep. He was dressed in buckskins, worn and dark with melted snow. His long black hair was matted with ice and something else. Clara took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. He was an Apache. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. Everything she'd ever heard, every story whispered in town, every terrified rumor of raids and killings, rushed into her mind. He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling. He lifted his head. In the firelight, she saw his face. It was hard, carved from stone, his features stark and strong, but his eyes were dull with pain. He looked at her, and then he collapsed again, falling fully into the doorway. Clara stood, paralyzed. The storm was flooding her home. Snow was piling on the floorboards. If she left him there, he would be dead by morning. The storm would take him. It would be easy. She could shut the door, bar it, and go back to the fire. He was an Indian. No one would ever know. No one would blame her. She looked at the shotgun on the table. She looked at the man. He was dying. A bitter, cold part of her, the part that had died with her husband, whispered to shut the door. But the part of her that was still human, the part that remembered kindness, however distant, couldn't do it. He was a man, and he was bleeding. "Damn you," she whispered. To him or to God? She grabbed his arms. It was like trying to move a mountain. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of muscle and wet leather. She put her shoulder under his armpit, braced her feet on the slick floor, and pulled. He groaned, a deep sound of agony. "You have to help me," she grunted, pulling again. He didn't respond. She fought for every inch. She dragged him, scraping his heavy body over the threshold. It took her long minutes, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming. Finally, he was inside. She slammed the door against the storm and dropped the bar back in place. She collapsed against the door, panting, her heart racing from fear and exertion. The cabin was freezing. She rushed to relight the lantern. In the weak yellow light, she saw the full extent of it. He was lying on his side on her floor. A dark, wet stain was spreading across his buckskin shirt, just under his ribs. It wasn't just melted snow. It was blood. She knelt beside him, her terror warring with a strange, numb practicality. She touched his neck. His skin was ice cold, but there was a pulse, thready and weak. She had to get him out of the wet clothes. She had to see the wound. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with the leather ties of his shirt. His skin, where it wasn't bruised, was a deep copper. He was built like she'd never seen a man built, wide shoulders, a deep chest, muscles lean and roped. Scars, old and white, crisscrossed his arms and chest. She finally pulled the wet shirt away. The wound was on his right side, a puckered, blackened hole, a rifle wound. Someone had shot him, and not at close range. It looked like the bullet had gone clean through, but he'd lost a sight of blood. She debated again, tending a wound like this. If he died here, what would she do? If he lived, what would he do? He let out a low sigh, his body relaxing into unconsciousness. Clara set her jaw. She wouldn't be a murderer, not even by omission. For the next 3 days, she worked. She dragged him onto her own narrow cot, the only bed in the cabin. She slept on the floor by the stove, wrapped in the blanket she'd been mending. She boiled water. She tore her last clean bedsheet into strips for bandages. She cleaned the wound as best she could. He had a fever, a raging heat that burned through his skin. She spent hours wiping his face and chest with snow-melted water, trying to bring the heat down. They barely spoke. On the second day, his fever broke. He woke, his eyes clear but cautious. He watched her as she moved about the cabin. He tracked her every movement. His presence was overwhelming. The cabin, already small, seemed to have shrunk to nothing. He was so large, so powerful, even lying down, so deeply intimidating. Yet, he was calm. He didn't threaten, he didn't demand. He just watched, his black eyes holding a depth she couldn't read. She brought him a cup of weak broth, made from boiling the last of her dried herbs with a spoonful of bean mash. He pushed himself up on one elbow. The movement was fluid, controlled, despite the pain it clearly caused him. He took the cup from her. Their fingers brushed. Clara pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned. "What is your name?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse. He looked at the broth, then back at her. His voice, when it came, was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. "Taza." He said nothing else. He drank the broth, handed her the empty cup, and lay back down. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was charged. He was awake. He was aware. And he was a stranger. A dangerous stranger. On the fourth day, she was kneading the last of her flour into a meager flatbread. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried in white. "Why did you come here?" she asked, her back to him. She couldn't look at him when she asked it. She needed this answer. He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't reply. "I was seen," he said. She turned. He was sitting up on the cot, his bare chest crisscrossed with her linen bandages. "Seen by who? The men who shot you?" "Yes, they were tracking me for 2 days. The storm, it hid me. But I was bleeding. I was dying in the snow." "But why here?" she insisted, her voice tight. "My cabin. Why my home?" Taza looked at her, his gaze steady. It felt as if he were seeing right through her skin, past the fear, and into the worn-out, lonely core of her. "I have seen this place before," he said, his voice low. "I watched from the ridge. I saw you alone. I saw you carry your gun. I saw the men in town turn their backs on you." Clara's blood ran cold. He had been watching her. He must have seen the fear on her face. He shifted, a slight wince of pain. "I didn't come here to hurt you," Taza said, his voice softer, but no less intense. "I came here because you didn't scream when you saw me." Clara stared at him, her hands white with flour. He meant the time in town. She remembered it now, a month ago, waiting outside the mercantile. He'd been standing across the street, watching. She'd met his eyes. She'd been too tired, too beaten down by the whispers of the white women, to feel fear. She'd just felt nothing. She hadn't screamed. She'd just held his gaze for a second, then turned away. He had remembered. She didn't know what to do with that, this massive, quiet man. His stillness unsettled her more than her husband's loud, drunken rages ever had. Her husband's violence had been predictable. This man's quiet strength was something entirely unknown. It made something deep inside her, something she'd thought long dead, stir. It was a frightening, unfamiliar warmth that felt almost like attraction, but it was tangled so tightly with fear that she couldn't separate the two. She turned back to her dough, her hands shaking again. "You should rest." The next day, Taza stood. He was weak, but he was determined. He walked to the door, his movements stiff. "Where are you going?" Clara asked, alarmed. "I cannot stay here. They will look for me. They will find you." "You're not healed," she said. "You'll die out there. The cold will kill you if the wound doesn't." "It is not your concern." He pulled on the buckskin shirt she had washed and mended for him. He paused, his hand on the door bar. He was breathing heavily, his face pale beneath his dark skin. "You should not have helped me," he said, not looking at her. "Well, I did." He tried to lift the bar. His arm trembled. He grunted, leaning his weight against the wood, but his strength failed him. He staggered back, his hand flying to his wounded side. He caught himself on the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Sit down," Clara ordered, her voice sharper than she intended. He looked at her, his pride warring with the pain. "Sit down before you tear your stitches and bleed all over my floor again." He glared at her. For a second, she saw the warrior. She saw the dangerousness. But then it passed. The strength ran out of him. He didn't collapse, but he sank back onto the stool by the table, his head bowed, his breathing ragged. Clara let out a shaky breath. He was still just a man, a wounded man. That night, the cold was bitter. The wind had returned. Taza was asleep on the cot, his breathing deep and even. He'd lost the fight to stay awake. Clara sat on the floor, her back against the wall by the stove, wrapped in her blanket. The fire was low, casting shadows that danced on the walls. It was just her, the wind, and the sound of this strange man breathing in her bed. She watched him sleep, in rest. His face was less hard. The lines of pain around his mouth had softened. He looked younger. She found herself speaking, whispering into the darkness. She wasn't talking to him. She was talking to the sleeping form, to the silence, to the one living soul who hadn't judged her. "I'm so tired," she whispered, the words tasting strange on her tongue. "I'm so tired of being alone." Tears she hadn't known were there began to well in her eyes, hot and sharp. "They all hate me. The women in town, they look at me like I'm dirt, like I wanted this, like I wanted him to—" She couldn't say it. "He's been gone 2 years, and I am still his prisoner. This land, this house, it's all I have, and they want to take it." She pulled the blanket tighter, rocking slightly. The tears ran down her face, cold on her cheeks. "I don't know how to survive this winter. I'm almost out of food. I'm afraid all the time." She looked over at the sleeping Apache, a man who had been hunted, shot, and left for dead. A man who had come to her door because she hadn't screamed. "I'm so tired of being hated," she whispered. And then she finally, truly, wept. She cried silently, her shoulders shaking, mourning 2 years of loss and a lifetime of pain in the presence of a sleeping stranger. Taza healed the way a wild thing heals, stubbornly, silently, and without complaint. He had stayed on the cot for 4 days. On the 5th, he swung his legs over the side, his movements stiff. Clara, stirring the last of her oatmeal, dropped the spoon. "What are you doing? You'll tear the wound open." He didn't look at her. He just pushed himself to his feet. He was unsteady, his hand gripping the cot's wooden frame, but he was standing. He towered in the small room, his head nearly brushing the low rafters. The sheer size of him made the cabin feel like a box. He moved slowly to the water bucket, dipped the ladle, and drank deep. Clara watched the muscles in his throat work. He finished and looked at her. "The roof, in the barn, it is broken." "I know it's broken. It's been broken. You can't—" "The snow will get in," he said. It was not a discussion. He pulled on his mended shirt. He walked out the door. Clara ran after him, grabbing her shawl. "You fool! You'll start bleeding again, and I don't have any more sheets to tear up." He was already at the barn, sliding the heavy door open. He paused, looking back at her. The wind was sharp, and it pulled at his long black hair. "Then I will bleed." He disappeared inside. Clara stood in the snow, furious and terrified. She cursed him. She cursed the wind. Then she went back inside, grabbed the remaining strips of linen, and marched to the barn. He was already on the ladder, examining the hole where the wind had torn the shingles away. He moved with a pained, careful economy. For the next week, a new routine settled. He would not stay idle. He worked. He was weak in the mornings, but by afternoon, he seemed to draw strength from the cold air itself. He mended the roof, using salvaged planks from her husband's broken wagon. He took her dull axe and spent an hour sharpening the blade on a river stone until it looked new. Then he began chopping. The woodpile, which had been perilously low, began to grow. The sound of his axe became the new rhythm of the homestead, a steady, solid thunk that rang out in the frozen air. It was a sound of provision, a sound of protection. It was a sound Clara hadn't realized how much she'd missed. He remained distant. He spoke only when necessary. "I need more water. Where's the hammer?" "The snow will be deep tonight." But he watched her. Clara felt his eyes on her constantly. When she was hanging her laundry on a line strung inside the cabin, she felt his gaze on her arms. When she bent over the stove, she felt him watching her back. It wasn't the way Silas Croft, the rancher from the neck spread over, watched her, a hungry, assessing look that made her feel like cattle. Taza's gaze was different. It was quiet, intense, and unreadable. He looked at her hands when she kneaded bread. He watched her face when she stared into the fire. His eyes lingered longer each day, and when she caught him, he did not look away. Clara always looked away first, her neck burning. She needed supplies. The flour was gone, the salt was low, and the coffee was a memory. She had to go to town. The thought of leaving him alone at the cabin filled her with a strange dread. The thought of bringing him with her was impossible. She waited for a clear morning, when the sun was bright on the snow. "I have to ride in to the mercantile." Taza was splitting kindling by the door. He nodded once. "They will talk." "They always talk. I need flour." "You will be back by dark." "I will." She saddled her old mare, Bess, her fingers numb. She looked back at the cabin. Taza stood in the doorway, a silent, dark shape against the light. He watched her until she was over the first ridge. The town was just as she'd left it, cold and hostile. "Mister." Hemlock barely acknowledged her, taking her 3 rabbit pelts and shoving a small sack of flour and a brick of salt toward her. "That's it?" Clara asked, looking at the meager trade. "These are prime pelts." "Winter's hard, Mrs. Bell," Hemlock said, not meeting her eyes. "Supply and demand." She knew it was a lie. She was being punished. As she tied the sack to her saddle, she saw Mrs. Davies and the preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, outside the dress shop. They stopped talking when they saw her. They huddled, their heads together, and cast quick, sharp glances her way. Clara mounted Bess and rode out, her back straight, her face a mask of indifference. She didn't know that Jebediah Smith, a local drunk who sometimes hunted stray cattle, had been cutting across her land 2 days prior. He'd seen Taza repairing the barn roof. He had ridden straight to town, his eyes wide, and traded the story for a bottle of whiskey. The whispers had already begun. "Clara Bell, the widow. She's taken up with a savage." The ride back was slow. The wind had picked up, and a heavy, bruised-looking cloud bank was moving in from the north. She was still 5 miles from home when she saw the rider. Silas Croft. He was sitting on his big bay horse, waiting for her on the trail. He was a thick-bodied man with a reddish beard and pale, greedy eyes. He'd propositioned her twice since her husband's funeral. The first time, he'd offered marriage. The second time, he hadn't. "Afternoon, Clara," he said, tipping his hat. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Silas?" She tried to ride past him, but he moved his horse to block the trail. "Cold day to be in town. Heard you're running low on supplies." "I manage." "Do you?" He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "Heard you got company out at your place." Clara's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do. Jeb Smith's seen him. A big Apache buck. Folks are concerned. Clara, deeply concerned." What folks? Decent folks. Folks who think it ain't right. A white woman living alone. And now this. He shook his head, a look of false pity on his face. It ain't safe. For you. A woman can't be trusted to know what's good for her when she's lonely. Get out of my way, Silas! His smile vanished. I'm trying to help you. That land your husband left, it's too much for you. It's dangerous. And now you've gone and invited the danger right into your house. He reached out, his gloved hand closing over her reins. I could help you, Clara. I could take that homestead off your hands, give you a fair price. You could come live in town. I'd look after you. Clara snatched her reins back. If you're so concerned for my safety, you can start by getting off my trail. Croft's face darkened. You listen to me. You get rid of that savage. You hear me, or I'll have the sheriff get rid of him. And if he gives us trouble, we'll take the land for your own safety. We can't have hostiles squatting on decent folks' property. He spurred his horse, riding past her close enough that his knee brushed her leg. You think on it. Clara, you're making a mistake. She watched him go, her entire body shaking. She rode the rest of the way home in a blind panic, the wind whipping her hair across her face. When she got to the cabin, Taza was there. He took the reins from her trembling hand. He looked at her face, then at the trail she'd come down. He didn't have to ask. He knows, Clara said, her voice thin. The whole town knows. A rancher, Silas Croft. He threatened me. He said he'd take the land. Taza was silent. He led the mare into the barn and began unbridling her. Clara followed him, wringing her hands. What are we going to do? He'll bring the sheriff. He'll bring men. Taza finished with the horse, rubbing her down with a dry sack. He worked without urgency. Did you hear me? Clara's voice was rising, bordering on hysteria. They'll come here. They'll kill you. Taza turned to her. His face was calm, illuminated by the single shaft of dusty light from the barn window. That man, Taza said, his voice a low rumble. Croft, he will be back. He wants your land. He wants you. I know that. I need to know what we're going to do. They will use me as the reason to take both, he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. He stepped closer. He was so tall. He blocked the light. You are one woman. They are many. You cannot hold this place alone. I don't need you to tell me that. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. I need a wife, he said plainly. Clara stared at him. The words hung in the cold, dusty air. Then she let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a broken, ugly sound. A wife? Is that what this is? You think this is a joke? You think you can just, what, propose to me? You need someone to protect you, he stated. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an offer. It was a fact. The laughter died in her throat. It was replaced by a sudden, hot wave of rage. It was the same rage she'd felt when her husband cornered her. The same helplessness. The same humiliation. Protect me? She spat. Is that what you call it? Just like Silas Croft. Just like my husband. You think because I'm alone, I'm property. You think you're better than them? She shoved him, her hands hitting his solid chest. It was like shoving a stone wall. You think you can just claim me because you fixed a roof and chopped some wood? You're just another man who wants to use me. She was screaming now, the tears she'd held back on the trail finally breaking free. She hit his chest again, her fists balled up. Taza stood perfectly still. He let her hit him. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hands. He just watched her, his face a mask of stone, his eyes holding a sadness she was too blind with anger to see. He absorbed her fury until it was spent. Clara's punches slowed, becoming weak shoves, until finally her hands just rested on his chest. She was sobbing, breathless, humiliated by her own outburst. He said nothing. He gently took her wrists and moved her hands aside. He turned, grabbed the one spare blanket from the tack room, a thin, worn thing, and walked past her. He left the barn. Clara stood there, shaking. She heard the cabin door open, then close. She thought he'd gone inside. She waited a minute, then stumbled back to the cabin herself, wiping her face on her sleeve. The cabin was empty. She looked out the window. Taza was crossing the yard, the blanket slung over his shoulder. He was walking back to the barn. She understood. He hadn't gone inside to get his things. He had gone inside to leave his things. He was moving out. He would sleep in the barn. He had left her alone. Her anger collapsed instantly, leaving a cold, hollow ache that was worse than the fear. 3 days passed. The silence was a sickness. Taza did not come to the cabin. He worked from sunup to sundown. He hauled water from the well. He dug stones from the frozen ground to reinforce the small corral. He sharpened the remaining tools. He ate the food she left for him on the porch, a bowl of bean soup, a piece of flatbread. But he never ate it in front of her. The cabin was empty again. But this was a new kind of emptiness. It wasn't just loneliness. It was absence. She missed his quiet presence. She missed the sound of him breathing in the dark. She missed the solid, unspoken safety his presence had provided. She found herself watching him from the window. He had taken off his shirt to chop wood, even in the biting cold. She watched the steam rise off his skin. She watched the muscles in his back and shoulders bunch and release, the easy, powerful grace of his body. A feeling she hadn't felt in years, a low, pulling heat deep in her belly, startled her. It was hunger, a sharp, undeniable wanting that she had thought her husband had beaten and broken out of her for good. She wanted to touch him. She wanted him to look at her again. The realization terrified her, and she hated herself for it. On the 4th day, they came. Clara was scattering the last of her chicken feed when she heard the horses. 3 of them. Silas Croft, and with him, 2 men she recognized from town, the Miller brothers, hired hands known for their cruelty and lack of sense. All 3 were armed with rifles. "Clara!" Croft called out, his voice oily and confident. He reined in 20 yards from the cabin. "We're here for your own good." The barn door was closed. Taza was inside. Clara's heart was a trapped bird. She picked up the shotgun, which was leaning against the woodpile. "Get off my land, Silas!" "Now, Clara, don't be like that," he laughed. The Miller brothers fanned out slightly, one moving toward the barn. "The townsfolk are worried. We're taking you back to town. For your safety. We'll look after the homestead until you're feeling more yourself." "I'm not going anywhere. This is my property." "Your property?" Croft's smile faded. "A lone woman can't hold this land, especially one shacked up with a redskin. Now, you tell that savage to come on out. We don't want any trouble. We just want him." "Get out!" Clara raised the shotgun. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely aim it. "She's serious," one of the Millers muttered, shifting his rifle. "She's hysterical," Croft snapped. "Put the gun down, Clara, before you hurt yourself." He started to dismount. The barn door scraped open. It was a slow, heavy sound. All 3 men froze. Taza emerged. He didn't rush. He stepped out into the weak afternoon sun, silent and massive. He wasn't wearing his shirt. His bare chest, crossed with old scars and the new healing line of the gunshot, seemed to soak up the light. He was armed with only the axe. He held it in one hand, the head resting lightly on his shoulder. It was a tool, but in his hand, it was a promise of death. He walked 10 paces and stopped, placing himself between Clara and the riders. He didn't look at them. He looked at Clara. He held her gaze for 1 long second. Then, he turned his head and stared at Silas Croft. He said nothing. The air went still. The Miller brothers looked at Taza, then at each other. They were paid to bully women, not to fight a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain itself. Taza's calm was more terrifying than any war cry. Silas Croft's face went pale. then red. He was a bully, and his bluff had been called. He looked at the axe. He looked at Taza's eyes. "This ain't over, Clara!" Croft spat, his voice suddenly tight. He stayed on his horse. "You're making a terrible mistake. The law will hear about this." He yanked his horse's head around. "Come on," he snarled at the millers. They retreated. They backed their horses up, then turned and rode away fast, kicking up snow. The silence they left behind was vast. There was only the sound of the wind. Clara's strength gave out. The shotgun slipped from her fingers, thudding softly into the snow. She was shaking from head to foot, so violently she could barely stand. Taza did not move. He stood, his back to her, watching the riders disappear. Finally, when they were gone, he let the axe slip from his shoulder, holding it at his side. He turned. He looked at her, standing there, shaking and exposed. He looked at the gun in the snow. He bent, picked it up, and leaned it against the cabin wall. Then he turned and walked back into the barn, pulling the door shut behind him. That night, Clara couldn't eat. She couldn't sit. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a bone-deep cold, a terror that was just now catching up with her. He had saved her. He had faced 3 armed men with an axe, for her, and she had screamed at him. She had called him a user. The wind howled. The cabin felt too small and too empty. She put on her shawl. She lit the lantern, though she didn't know why. She opened the cabin door and stepped out into the bitter cold. The moon was a thin sliver, casting a pale, ghostly light on the snow. She walked to the barn. Her boots made no sound. She pulled the heavy door open just wide enough to slip inside. It was dark. It smelled of cold hay, animals, and him. The lantern cast flickering shadows. He was in the far stall, the one that used to hold her husband's stallion. He had made a bed of straw. He was sitting up, his back against the wall, the thin blanket over his legs. He was not asleep. He was waiting. He watched her approach. She stopped a few feet from him, shaking, silent. The lantern light caught the hard planes of his face. He just watched her. He didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you felt too small. I'm sorry felt too large." She took a step closer. She set the lantern down on a bale of hay. She stood over him, her shadow falling across his chest. Slowly, she raised a trembling hand. She reached out and touched his chest. She laid her palm flat against his skin, over the hard muscle, just above his heart. It was warm, so warm. The simple, solid warmth broke her. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, animal sound of grief and fear and relief. Her legs gave way. She didn't fall to the ground. She collapsed forward, into him, burying her face against his shoulder, clinging to him. She sobbed. She cried for her dead husband, for the years of pain. She cried for the fear of Silas Croft. She cried for the crushing, endless loneliness. Taza was stiff. He was stone. He was not used to being touched this way. For a long moment, he just sat there, rigid, as she wept into his skin. Then, slowly, his arms came up. One hand settled on her back, large and heavy, holding her steady. The other hand found the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her loose hair. He held her. He just held her, absorbing her grief as he had absorbed her anger. Her sobs quieted. She was left breathing against his neck, her body still trembling. There was nothing left but the dark, the cold, and the sound of their breathing. Grief, need, and a fierce, terrifying vulnerability charged the air. She pulled her head back. She looked at his face, so close in the lantern light. His eyes were black, deep, and filled with a gentleness that undid her completely. She rose up on her knees. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a clumsy, desperate kiss. It was salt and snow and need. He resisted. His whole body tensed. His lips were firm, unmoving. He turned his head slightly. Clara stopped, humiliated. She started to pull away, but his hand, the one in her hair, tightened. It wasn't rough. It was insistent. He turned his face back to hers. He looked into her eyes, and then he kissed her back. It was nothing like her husband's kisses. It wasn't wet or bruising or demanding. It was devastatingly gentle. It was slow. His lips were firm, dry, and warm. He kissed her as if he were tasting water after a drought. He kissed her as if she were something precious, something he was afraid to break. It was a kiss of profound, staggering loneliness. It was an answer. The kiss deepened. It became something else. It wasn't just gentle anymore. It was raw. It was the desperate, starved yearning of two hearts that had been empty for too long. His hand slid from her back, around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Her hands clung to his shoulders. It was cold, and they were clumsy. Their clothes were rough. The hay scratched her knees. But his mouth was warm, and his body was a furnace. He laid her back in the straw, his massive body shielding her from the cold. This was not lust, not the way the town understood it. This was survival. This was two broken, shipwrecked souls clinging to the same piece of driftwood in a frozen sea. Their intimacy was slow. It was awkward. It was discovery. When he finally entered her, she gasped, but not from pain. It was the first time a man had touched her in true, terrible, gentle need. It was the first time she had ever felt safe. He held her face between his large, rough hands, his thumbs stroking her temples, and his eyes never left hers. He moved with a reverence that felt like prayer, a deep, soulful connection that stitched the broken pieces of her back together. They found warmth, not just in their bodies, but in the desperate, shared understanding that tonight, in this cold, dark barn, they were not alone. The light that woke Clara was thin and gray, the color of dirty snow. It cut through the gaps in the barn wall, stripping the night of its desperate, warm magic. She was lying in the straw, tangled in the rough wool of Taza's blanket. He was asleep beside her, his breathing a deep, slow rhythm. His arm was thrown across her waist, heavy and possessive even in sleep. Shame, cold and sharp, washed over her. She looked at his face in the dim light. The hard lines were softened, but he was still a stranger, a man she had coupled with in the dark, driven by a loneliness so deep it felt like starvation. What had she done? She slipped out from under his arm, her movements careful, desperate not to wake him. The straw pricked her bare skin. She found her clothes, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, her hands shaking. She felt used, not by him, by her own weakness. She ran from the barn, her boots crunching in the new snow. The cold air hit her face like a slap, but it couldn't clear her head. She burst into the cabin, slammed the door, and dropped the bar. She leaned against it, panting, as if she were the one who had been hunted. The cabin was silent. It was her home. It was her sanctuary, and she had betrayed it. She had invited the very danger she'd been fighting into her own bed, or rather, into the straw. She spent the morning in a frantic, useless burst of energy. She scrubbed the floorboards, though they were already clean. She reorganized the root cellar, her hands shaking as she stacked the few remaining turnips. She was avoiding him. She was terrified of the moment the barn door would open. It opened around 8 o'clock. She saw him from the window. He stood in the barn doorway for a long minute, just looking at the cabin. He was wearing his shirt. He looked, as always, solid and calm. Then he turned, picked up the axe, and walked to the far side of the property, to the stand of piñón. He did not come to the house. The sound of his axe began, a steady beat against the silence. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The tension in the cabin grew so thick. Clara felt she might choke on it. He was out there. He was working. He wasn't leaving. He wasn't approaching. He was waiting. She left a tin plate of cold flatbread and a cup of water on the porch step. When she checked an hour later, it was gone. This became their new pattern. For 3 days, they lived as two ghosts on the same land. Clara stayed in the cabin, a prisoner of her own fear and confusion. Taza stayed outside. He did not just chop wood. He began to work. He was a man of ceaseless, quiet action. He dug new post holes, his body straining in the frozen earth. He was expanding the fence line, making the perimeter of her homestead larger, stronger. He salvaged the good wood from her husband's collapsed woodshed and began repairing the smokehouse, his hammer blows precise and measured. Clara watched him from behind the curtain. Every swing of the axe, every post he set, was a wordless statement. He was not a guest. He was not a hired hand. He was a man building a fortress. His gestures were not apologies. They were acts of deliberate, unspoken care. He was tending to her, to the land, in the only way he knew how. On the 4th day, she couldn't stand the silence anymore. She couldn't stand her own cowardice. He was mending the corral gate, splicing a new piece of wood onto the broken hinge. She put on her shawl and walked out, her heart hammering. She stood 10 feet from him. He had to have heard her approach, but he didn't stop his work. He kept tightening the leather straps, his large hands surprisingly deft. "Why are you doing this?" she finally asked. Her voice was thin, stolen by the wind. He finished his knot before he turned to her. His face was unreadable. "It is broken." "No." She shook her head, pulling the shawl tighter. "Why are you staying? After what I said, after the barn?" He looked at her, his gaze steady. "I have nowhere else to be. You have nowhere else to be. This is a good place. It needs guarding." "I don't need a guard," she lied. "Yes," he said, simply, without judgment. "You do." He turned back to the gate, testing its swing. He was dismissing her. The old anger rose, but it was hollow. He was right. She was terrified. She was terrified of Silas Croft, but she was just as terrified of this man who made her feel safe. Safety was a trick. Safety was what her husband had promised before he'd locked the door. "You don't understand," she whispered. He stopped. He turned back to her. Fully. He waited. The words came out, brittle and sharp, torn from a place she had buried for years. "I've never felt safe. Not really. My husband. He was a good provider. The town said he kept me safe from the elements. But he... She had to look away. She stared at the new wood of the fence, at the clean cuts he had made. "I was pregnant once," she said to the fence post. The air went still. She heard Taza take a single, quiet breath. "It was our first year here. I was happy. I thought it would make him softer. It made him meaner. He was drunk. He was angry I hadn't mended his shirt right. He hit me." She wrapped her arms around her own stomach, as if feeling a ghost. "He beat it right out of me. I lost the child, and after that, I just died. I just waited for him to die." She finally looked at Taza. His face had not changed, but his eyes were full of a terrible, ancient darkness. "I've never felt safe with a man, not ever, until you came." Her voice broke. "And that terrifies me more than Silas Croft, because I don't know what is real. I don't know if what happened in the barn was me, or just the loneliness. I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid because I'm not afraid of you. Do you understand that?" He stood in silence for a full minute. The wind whistled over the ridge. "I understand," he said, his voice low. "You fear the quiet. You wait for the storm." "Yes," she wept, a single hot tear that froze on her cheek. He looked away from her, up at the mountains. "I was a warrior. For my people. We fought the soldiers. We fought the Mexicans. We fought everyone. I was good at it." He touched one of the old white scars on his forearm. "They told us to be ghosts. They told us to kill, to make the white eyes fear the night. And I saw too much blood." He paused. His jaw tightened. "Then came a time, 2 summers ago. We tracked a wagon, settlers. They were slow, an old man, 2 women, 3 children. It was easy. Our leader said to leave no one, no witnesses." His eyes were distant, seeing something she could not. "The warriors. They began. The screaming. I heard the children. They were hiding under the wagon. A boy and a girl, like fawns, just waiting." He stopped. He closed his eyes. "I would not," he whispered. I pulled the leader from his horse. I said, "No more, not children. I fought my own people. I let the wagon go." He opened his eyes. They were bleak. "My leader cast me out. He called me Ndita, the one who is not. I was a ghost to them. So I ran." "And the soldiers?" Clara breathed. "The soldiers, they found me. They said I was a renegade, that I had been with the war party. They did not care that I had stopped them. They put a rope on my neck, to hang me. I killed 2 of them. I took a bullet." He touched his side, where her bandages still were. "And I ran from them. I have been running from everyone, until the storm, until your door." He looked back at her. "I still dream of it, the screaming. I wake, and I do not know whose side I am on. I do not know if I am the killer, or the one who saves." He had given her his pain, in exchange for hers. He had matched her brokenness. They stood in the frozen yard. 2 survivors, bound not by a vow, but by the scars they had shown each other. The tension was gone. In its place was a heavy, fragile understanding. That night, he came to the cabin door. She had left it unbarred. He didn't knock. He just stood on the step, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. He had his blanket in his hand. "Let them say what they want," he said, his voice a low rumble. "The Mancroft, the town. They will come back. They will always come back." He met her eyes. "If I live here, I will guard this land. If you live here, I will guard you." It was his proposal, remade. It was not a request. It was a statement, a fact. Clara felt the last of her defenses crumble. This wasn't her husband's ownership. This wasn't Silas Croft's greedy claiming. This was a pledge from one broken soul to another. I don't care what people say," she whispered, her voice thick. "I stopped caring a long time ago." She stepped closer, so she was standing in the doorway, looking up at him. "But I have to know," she said, her voice shaking with the weight of the question. "I was owned. For 6 years. I will not be owned again. Taza, I don't care about the land. I care about being. I need." She couldn't say the word loved. It was too foreign. "I need to be seen, not just protected." He gave her silence. He looked at her, his face full of things he had no words for. He was a man of action, of stone and wood and survival. He did not have the easy words of white men. So, after a long, aching moment, he just raised his hand. He did not touch her face. He did not pull her close. He simply, gently, took her hand. His fingers, rough and calloused, closed around hers. It was a promise. It was an answer. It was yes. Clara's breath hitched. She held his hand, and then she stepped back, pulling him with her. Into the warmth of the cabin, she shut the door, and for the first time, she dropped the bar with him on the inside. He slept on the floor by the fire, a silent guardian. For a week, this was their way. They worked together. They ate at the same table, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. And then, their shared life deepened. The nightmares that had haunted Taza returned. Clara woke one night to a muffled sound, a pained groan. He was on the floor, tangled in his blanket, his arms up as if to ward off a blow. He was dreaming of the rope. She knelt beside him, touching his shoulder. "Taza, you are here. You are safe." He woke with a violent start, his hand clamping around her wrist. He was powerful, and for a second, she felt the old fear. But he blinked, saw her, and his grip vanished. He was panting, his face slick with sweat. She didn't go back to her cot. She sat with him, her hand on his back, until his breathing slowed. The next night, she put another blanket on her cot. "The floor is too cold. You will get sick again." He looked at her, then at the cot. He lay down, his body filling the small space. Clara lay beside him, rigid, on the very edge. They lay like two planks of wood, not touching, but by morning, she had found her way to his warmth, her head on his shoulder. Their physical relationship, when it rekindled, was not the desperate, frantic collision in the barn. It was knowing. Sometimes it was rough, an urgent, fierce claiming in the middle of the day, a way of reminding themselves they were alive, a way of pushing back the world that wanted to kill them. But more often, it was gentle. It was at night, when the world was dark and the wind was high. He would hold her as if she were made of thin glass. He would touch her face, her hair, her scars, with a reverence that made her feel whole. He was a slow, careful lover, and he taught her, wordlessly, that her body was not a thing to be used, but a thing to be cherished. They built a life. They fell into the simple rhythm of daily chores. They were a team. He taught her to track rabbits in the snow. She began teaching him to read, using her late mother's Bible. He would sit at the table, his large finger tracing the strange lines. In the beginning, he said the words slowly, the sound foreign and wonderful in his deep voice. One afternoon, while mending the fence, she tripped over a loose stone. He caught her before she fell, his arm locking around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. She looked up at him, startled. He looked down at her, and a slow, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. Clara felt a strange bubble in her chest. She laughed. It was a real, light sound, one she hadn't heard from herself in years. The sound startled them both. Taza's smile widened for a second before he composed his face. He set her on her feet, but his hand lingered on her arm. They were, for a moment, just a man and a woman, happy. The peace lasted for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of quiet work, shared meals, and growing warmth. Then the rider came. It wasn't Silas Croft. This was a man in an official-looking coat. Despite the cold, he was a territorial post rider, and he looked tired. "Clara Belle," he called from the gate. Taza came to stand in the cabin doorway, just behind Clara. His presence was a silent warning. "I am," Clara said. "Got a letter for you, from the magistrate's office in Santa Fe." He held it out. Clara's hand trembled as she took it. It was thick, sealed with wax. She thanked the man, who nodded and rode off, eager to be gone. She stared at the envelope. "Magistrate?" She broke the seal. Taza watched her face. He saw the color drain from it. He saw her hand begin to shake. "Clara." She read the words aloud, her voice a dead monotone. "Notice of legal claim, to the property, 90 acres, homestead patent, filed by Ebenezer Bell." "Ebenezer Bell?" Taza asked. "My husband's cousin?" Clara whispered, the paper rattling in her grip. "From back east. I've never even met him. He says my husband's patent was invalid. That is a woman. I have no legal right to hold it. He's claiming the land." The letter was a death warrant for the life she had just begun to build. It lay on the rough-hewn table, a white patch of poison in the center of their small, warm cabin. Clara stared at it, her hands numb. Ebenezer Bell, a name she'd heard her husband curse once, a name from a life back east she'd never known. Now, that name was reaching across the continent to snatch away the only thing she had left. Taza stood by the door, watching her. He had not read the paper, but he had read her face. The knock came 2 days later. It was not a polite knock. It was the heavy, official thud of authority. Taza moved to stand beside her, his hand near the axe that now rested permanently by the hearth. Clara opened the door. 2 men stood on her porch. One wore a star pinned to a heavy wool coat. Sheriff Brody. He was a decent man, as far as she knew, but his face was set in lines of grim duty. The other man was thin, wearing a suit that looked out of place in the snow. He held a leather satchel. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat. He did not look at Taza, but he was acutely aware of him. "This here is Mr. Fields, from the Territorial Land Office. We're here about the notice you received." "Mr. Fields said, his voice flat and dry. He opened his satchel and produced a copy of the same letter. "Mr. Ebenezer Bell has filed a formal claim against this patent. The original patent was filed by your late husband, but upon his death, the claim is considered unresolved. As a widow, without male issue, your right to hold the patent is not recognized by the territorial government." "This is my home," Clara said, her voice hollow. "It was your husband's home, ma'am," Fields corrected, as if speaking to a child. "The law is clear. Mr. Bell, as the closest living male relative, has the primary claim." "So you're just giving it to him?" "We are giving you notice," Sheriff Brody interrupted, his voice rough with discomfort. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises." Clara felt the floor drop out from under her. 30 days, into the dead of winter. It was a death sentence. "However," Mr. Fields continued, "there are 2 stipulations. The claim can be secured if you can provide binding proof of ownership, which, I am afraid, you do not possess, or—" He paused, and his eyes slid, for the first time, to Taza. The look was one of complete disdain. "Or, if you remarry, a new husband would assume the patent and the legal right to defend it against Mr. Bell's claim." The air crackled. The sheriff looked at his boots. "Of course," Mr. Fields added, a thin smile touching his lips. "That husband would have to be someone legally eligible to hold a land patent, a citizen, a white man." The words hung in the frozen air, a wall of ice between Taza and the world. Clara stared at them, her mind blank with shock. 30 days, Mrs. Bell, the sheriff repeated, his voice low. "I'm sorry, but that's the law." He turned and walked back to his horse. "Mr." Fields gave a curt nod, placed the new paper on her doorstep as if he didn't want to touch her, and followed. Clara stood in the doorway, watching them ride away, until they were just 2 small dots against the white. She closed the door. She did not bar it. What was the point? The law was already inside. She sat at the table for hours, the cabin silent. Taza did not speak. He stoked the fire. He brought her a cup of water, which she did not drink. He stood by the window, watching the snow begin to fall again, his back a rigid wall of muscle. The sun went down, the cabin filled with shadows. "You should do it," Taza said to the window. Clara did not move. "Do what?" "Marry." She flinched, as if he had struck her. He turned to face her. His face was carved from stone, his eyes holding a bleakness that matched the landscape. "That man, Croft, he wants this land. He wants you. He is acceptable." Clara stared at him, her mind unable to catch up to the words. "He is a white man," Taza continued, his voice a low, hard rumble. "He is a citizen. He would be legally eligible. You could keep your home." "And you," she whispered. "I will leave," he said. "I will go north, to the mountains. When the snow thaws, you will be safe." He was offering it as a solution, a clean cut. He was sacrificing himself. The way he had tried to sacrifice himself for the children in the wagon. He was making himself a ghost again. She rose from the chair. She walked across the small room until she was standing in front of him. He loomed over her, a mountain of quiet, terrible resolve. He thought this was noble. He thought this was the answer. He did not understand. He did not understand anything. He had mistaken what they were. He thought he was just a guard. He thought the land was the prize. He thought her body was a piece of property to be traded to another eligible man for her own survival. All the fear, all the despair, all the love she had been terrified to name, coalesced into a single, blinding point of rage and heartbreak. Clara slapped him. Her hand cracked across his face with all the force in her body. It was a sharp, ugly sound in the quiet cabin. Taza did not flinch. He did not move. He did not even blink. He just looked at her, the red print of her hand stark against his skin. "You fool," she whispered, her voice breaking, the tears finally coming. You think this is what I've been fighting for?" She gestured around the small, poor cabin. "This dirt, these walls?" She hit his chest with her fists, the blows thudding uselessly against him. "I survived my husband. I survived the town. I survived the cold. I can survive losing this. I can walk away from this land and never look back." She looked up at him, her eyes flooded, her heart breaking. "If I lose the land, fine, but I won't lose you." She grabbed the front of his shirt. "I won't lose you." His stillness broke. He looked at her, truly seeing her, the fire in her, the desperation, the choice she had just made. She had chosen him, a man with no name, no rights, no home. She had chosen him over everything. His hands came up and framed her face, his rough thumbs wiping away her tears. He said nothing, but his eyes were no longer bleak. He kissed her. It was not the gentle exploration of the barn, or the quiet reverence of the nights in the cot. It was a fierce, desperate kiss, a kiss that tasted of salt and fear and a terrible, final goodbye. They did not speak. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the cot. They made love like they were saying farewell. It was rough, urgent, and deeply, profoundly sad. It was a fight against the law, against the snow, against the entire world that was trying to tear them apart. They clung to each other, two bodies against the cold, trying to memorize the feel of skin, the taste of a mouth, the sound of a heartbeat. They were trying to make a memory strong enough to last a winter. Afterward, in the dark, she lay tangled in his arms, her head on his chest. The cabin was silent, save for the wind. Clara broke down. It was not the wild sobbing of the barn. It was a quiet, hopeless weeping. "Don't let them take this," she whispered into his skin. "Please, Taza, don't let them take this." He held her, his arm a band of steel around her. He said nothing. He just held her until she fell into an exhausted, broken sleep. He did not sleep. He lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, feeling her heart beat against his. He felt the imprint of her hand on his face. He felt the imprint of her soul on his. Before dawn, he slipped from the bed. He dressed silently in the dark. He put on his mended shirt, his buckskins. He took the last of the flatbread and the small pouch of coins she kept in a jar, his pay for the pelts he had trapped. Clara woke as he opened the door. The cold air rushed in. "Taza," she said, her voice thick with sleep and fear. He stood in the doorway, a silhouette against the gray, pre-dawn light. "Where are you going?" she asked, sitting up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Town," he said. "No, Taza, they'll arrest you, or worse, Silas Croft." "I will be back," he said, and before she could say another word, he was gone, shutting the door behind him. She ran to the window. She watched him go to the barn. He didn't take his own meager belongings. He saddled her mare. "Bess, He rode out, not toward the mountains, but straight down the trail, toward town, alone. The town was just waking up. Smoke curled from chimneys. Mister. Hemlock was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the mercantile. He saw Taza first. He froze, the broom still in his hands. Taza rode down the center of the main street. He did not look left or right. He was a specter of the wilderness, riding into the heart of the law. People stopped. Faces appeared in windows. Men stepped out of the saloon, their drinks in hand. They stared. They had seen him as a whisper, a rumor. Now, here he was, large as life, riding Clarabelle's horse. He dismounted in front of the courthouse. He tied Bess to the rail. He did not look at the men who were now gathering on the boardwalk. Whispering, he walked up the steps and pushed the doors open. The courthouse was warm. A young deputy was asleep at a desk. At the far end of the room, Judge Miller, a man with a heavy jowl and colder eyes, was reading a ledger. "Get out," the judge said, not looking up. "No Indians in the courthouse. Go to the territorial agent's office at the back." "I am not here for the agent," Taza said. His voice, deep and calm, made the judge look up. The judge's eyes widened, first in surprise, then in anger.
"I told you to get out! Buck! Deputy!"
The deputy jolted awake, fumbling for his sidearm. Taza did not move. "I am here for the woman," he said, his voice filling the room. "Clarabelle."
"What about her?"
the judge snapped. "You tell her she must marry a citizen, a white man, to keep her land. That's the law. Now get out before I have you thrown in a cell for vagrancy."
"I am here,"
Taza said, taking a step forward. The deputy raised his gun. Taza ignored him. "To be recognized." He reached into his shirt. The deputy tensed. Taza pulled out a small, worn object. It was a piece of carved antler, tied with a leather thong. He placed it on the judge's desk.
"What is this trash?"
the judge asked. "It is a marriage token. Of my people, I have given it. She has accepted it. We are joined." The judge stared at him, then let out a short, barking laugh. "A tribal marriage? Here? That's not worth the dust on your boots. It's not recognized. It's not legal." "Then you will make it legal." Taza said. It was not a request. "I will not. This is a white territory, under white laws. Now, I'm warning you." "You will make it legal," Taza repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Or you will tell the entire town that your law, the white law, is here only to steal land from a widow. You will tell them you honor the claim of a man she has never seen, over the man who guards her home. You have no rights here. You are not a citizen." "I am a man. She is a woman. We live as one. I demand a hearing. That is the law." The judge's face turned purple. He was trapped. He knew Taza was, in some obscure way, correct. He could demand a hearing. "Fine," the judge spat. "You'll have your hearing, right now." He nodded to the deputy. "Go fetch Mrs. Bell. We'll settle this." "No," a voice said from the doorway. They all turned. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, stood there. She was holding a basket, her face pale but set. She had been on her way to the mercantile. She had seen Taza enter the courthouse. "Judge Miller," she said, stepping inside. "You will not be dragging that poor woman all the way into town for this spectacle." "Mrs. Gable, this is official business. It does not concern you." "It concerns everyone," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority the judge could not ignore. She walked forward, placing herself between Taza and the judge's desk. She did not look at Taza. She looked right at the judge. "I have known Clarabelle for 7 years. I was one of the women. I was one of the women who shunned her." Her voice wavered, but she gripped her basket tighter. "I whispered. I turned my back. I judged her for staying with that brute of a husband. I judged her for not grieving when he died. She took a deep breath. I was wrong. I was in the mercantile 3 years ago. Clara came in. It was summer. She was buying flour. Her husband was outside. She had a bonnet on, but when she reached for the flour sack, her sleeve rode up. Her arm, Judge, her arm was black with bruises. From the wrist to the elbow. Mr. Hemlock saw it. We all saw it. And we did nothing. The courthouse was silent. The deputy looked at the floor. That woman, Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling with conviction, has endured more than any of us. She has stayed on that land. She has survived, alone, through her own strength. If she has found a man, I do not care what color he is, who treats her with kindness, who protects her, who stands for her, then it is not our place to judge. It is our place to be witnesses. She turned and looked at Taza. I will be the witness. I saw her bruises. I see her now. She is strong. She deserves peace. She deserves this man. The judge stared at her, his mouth open. Mrs. Gable was the moral center of the town. To defy her was to defy the church, to defy decency itself. His eyes darted from Mrs. Gable's righteous face to Taza's immovable one. He was beaten. This is highly irregular, he sputtered. He picked up a pen. He pulled a new sheet of paper. An affidavit, recognizing a tribal union, for the purposes of the patent claim only. He began to write. Back at the ranch, Clara was pacing. Every sound made her jump. The sun was high. He had been gone for hours. Then she heard them. Horses. Too many. She grabbed the shotgun. She ran to the door. It wasn't the sheriff. It wasn't Taza. It was 3 men. One, in front, was dressed in city clothes, a dark coat, a bowler hat. He looked soft, with a pale, pinched face. Behind him were the Miller brothers, the same men Silas Croft had brought. They had rifles. Mrs. Bell? The man in the hat called out. He was trying to sound pleasant. Who are you? Clara demanded, the shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. I am Ebenezer Bell, your husband's cousin. He smiled, a thin, watery expression. I'm afraid I've come about the land. The law says it's mine. I'm here to take possession. The law gave me 30 days. I'm afraid I've petitioned to have that shortened, given the circumstances. Your cohabitation with a savage, it's a moral failing. The judge agreed. I have the writ right here. He patted his coat pocket. Now, please, step aside. We'll be happy to escort you to town. The Miller brothers fanned out, their rifles held ready. No, Clara said. Ma'am, don't be difficult. You are outnumbered. This is my home, she screamed. She raised the shotgun and fired a blast into the air. The sound cracked across the snow. The Millers raised their rifles. Don't shoot her, you fools, Ebenezer yelped, sliding off his horse. Just get her out of the house. One of the Millers advanced. Put the gun down. Widow, it's over. Clara backed into the doorway, her hands shaking, fumbling to reload. She was trapped. Get away from her. The voice was a roar. It came from the trail. Ebenezer Bell spun around. The Miller brothers turned. Taza was galloping toward them on the mare. He wasn't just holding the reins. In his other hand, he held a new rifle. He'd spent the last of the pelt money. He didn't slow down. He rode Bess right at the Miller brothers, forcing their horses to rear and scatter. He pulled the mare to a skidding halt, jumping from the saddle before she had even stopped. He landed between Clara and her attackers. He leveled the rifle, not at Ebenezer, but at the hired guns. What is this? Ebenezer shrieked. This is my property. I have the law. So do I, Taza said. He reached into his shirt and threw a folded piece of paper at Ebenezer's feet. The law, signed by the judge. She is my wife. This land is hers. Ebenezer stared at the paper in the snow, his face a mask of disbelief. One of the Miller brothers, regaining his nerve, aimed his rifle at Taza.
He's just one Indian.
Taza did not move. He did not aim to kill. He held the rifle steady. His voice was low, and it carried across the frozen yard with absolute finality. "One step closer," he said, his eyes on the man, "and I will protect what's mine." There was no doubt he would. The Miller brother looked at Taza's eyes. He looked at the rifle. He looked at Ebenezer Bell, who was trembling. This wasn't worth dying for. He lowered his gun.
This isn't over,
Ebenezer stammered. He scrambled back onto his horse.
"I'll go back to Santa Fe. I'll see the governor."
"Go," Taza said. The cousin and his hired guns retreated, riding away in a panicked, clumsy cluster. Silence fell. Taza stood, the rifle still raised, until they were gone. Clara was still in the doorway, the shotgun heavy in her arms. He turned to her. He lowered the rifle. He had done it. He had faced the law. He had faced the guns. He had won. The shotgun slid from her hands. She collapsed into his arms, her body shaking so hard she could not stand. He dropped his own rifle and caught her, holding her up. She buried her face in his chest, sobbing, not in fear, but in a profound, shattering release. He held her, his hand stroking her hair.
"We'll lose it,"
she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt.
"Someday, they'll find a way. They'll come back. We're going to lose everything."
Taza held her, looking out over the land that was theirs, the land that was, for today, safe. "Then we build again," he said. The paper signed by the judge was a shield. It was not food, and it was not warmth. January came down from the mountains like a wolf, lean and starving, and the world turned to iron. The victory in town had cost them. It had cost Taza the last of their pelt money for the new rifle, and it had cost Clara the last of her credit. Mr. Hemlock, seeing which way the wind blew, turned his back on her when she came to the mercantile. He would not trade for her mending. He would not give her flour for the few eggs her chickens laid. The town had closed ranks. The legal paper had made them an island, and now the sea of winter was rising. Ebenezer Bell did not return. The 30 days came and went. The land was legally theirs, a fortress of snow-covered dirt, but the siege had truly begun. The root cellar was a hollow, cold space. The potatoes were gone. The last of the dried beans were counted out, 8 apiece, for their supper. Hunger, a constant, dull ache, became a third person in the cabin. Taza took the new rifle and his traps and walked into the white. He was gone for 2 days, and then 2 more. Clara waited. The silence of the cabin was a living thing, heavy and cold. She fed the fire with the wood he had chopped, rationing that as well, 1 log every 2 hours. She feared he had left her. She feared he had met Silas Croft on a lonely trail. She feared he had simply walked away, back to the mountains, leaving her to the fate the town intended. He returned on the 4th evening, a dark shape against the blue twilight snow. He was half frozen, but he was carrying a small, gaunt deer across his shoulders. He had been tracking it for 2 days. He had 2 rabbits tied to his belt. Clara dropped the water bucket, her hands flying to her mouth. She did not weep. She was past tears. She just felt a profound, bone-deep relief. He said nothing. He dropped the game by the door, pulled his knife, and began the work of skinning. That night, they ate fresh meat, roasted over the fire, and the taste was life itself. Their world shrank. It became the cabin, the barn, the woodpile, and the trap lines. Taza hunted, his face grim and purposeful. He guarded. Clara maintained the cabin, mended their clothes until the threads were as thin as spider webs, and portioned their food with a ruthless hand. They spoke little. There was little to say that the wind was not already screaming. In the long, dark evenings, The silence inside the cabin became as vast as the silence outside. The wind clawed at the walls, a beast trying to get in. Clara unearthed her mother's Bible. It was the only book she owned. A heavy, black-bound volume with fragile, tissue-thin pages. "You should learn the words," she said one night. Taza was by the fire, sharpening his knife. The sound of the stone on the steel was the only sound in the room. He looked at the book as if it were a snake. "It is your book," he said. "It is a book." She sat on the floor beside him, the cot now their shared bed, and opened it to the first page. "It is full of words. You know the sounds. You just need to know the shapes." He was a slow, stubborn student. His large fingers, calloused and scarred from the axe in the cold, were clumsy tracing the small, black letters. He was a man of the earth, of signs, of the movement of clouds. These scratches on a page were a foreign magic. "Ja," he would say, his deep voice struggling with the sound, pointing to the first letter of Genesis. "G," Clara corrected, her voice gentle. She put her finger over his. "God." "God," he said the word. He looked at the fire, not at her. "The white man's spirit." "A spirit," she said. "Words are words. Taza, I just want you to have them." He learned the shapes of land, and snow, and bread. He learned his own name, Taza. He learned hers, Clara. He touched the letters of her name on the page, a look of quiet wonder on his face, as if he had just discovered the shape of her. This, more than the shared bed, became their new intimacy. It was not the desperate, starved heat of the barn. It was not the fierce, sad coupling of their goodbyes. It was the slow, patient warmth of a shared task. Their relationship, born in violence and necessity, was maturing. It was finding its own quiet rhythm. It was in the comfortable silence as they ate their meager supper. It was in the way he no longer watched her every move, but seemed to know where she was, always, his body angled toward her even when he was mending a trap. It was in the quick, wordless glance they shared when a coyote howled too close, a look that said, "We are here. We are safe for tonight." It was in the small, rare sound of his laugh. It was a low rumble in his chest, surprising them both when she dropped a hot pot lid on the floor and cursed it roundly. Laughter. It had been a stranger in this cabin for so long. Now, it returned in stolen moments, fragile as a spring thaw, but real. One night, a true blizzard hit, a wall of white that erased the world, trapping them inside for 3 days. The wind screamed, a chorus of demons at the door. Taza sat by the fire. He was working on something he shielded with his body. He had found a piece of antler in the woods, hard as stone, and he worked at it with his knife. He carved, and he sanded it smooth with a piece of rough sandstone he kept for his blade. Clara watched him, mending his shirt. The needle moved in and out. The fire crackled. The wind shrieked. Inside, there was only the sound of his knife scraping the bone, a patient, rhythmic sound. On the 3rd night, he finished. He did not say anything. He did not make a speech. He just reached for her left hand. She gave it to him. Her fingers were chapped from the cold and stained with soot. He held her hand, his thumb brushing the skin of her 4th finger. It was bare. Her husband had never given her a ring. He had said a wife was marked by her husband's name, not by a piece of gold. Taza opened his own hand. On his broad, scarred palm lay a ring, carved from the bone. It was simple, pale, and perfectly smooth. It was warm from his skin. He did not ask. He just slid it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Clara stared at it. It was a solid, real thing, a circle, with no beginning and no end. A promise made in bone, not in words. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. She looked up at him. His black eyes were soft in the firelight. He was watching her face, waiting. Tears welled, hot and sudden. But they were not tears of fear or sadness. "I was so lonely," she whispered. Not to him, but to the ring, to the fire. All my life, even when he was here, I was always so empty. She closed her hand, feeling the ring press into her skin. A solid anchor. She looked at him, her husband, her protector, her Taza. I'm not lonely anymore. He raised her hand to his lips. He did not kiss her. He kissed the ring, a gesture of profound, gentle possession that sealed the vow. The world outside the cabin, however, was not at peace. The winter held. Word of their defiance, of the judge's forced affidavit, had spread. Mrs. Gable had spoken, and while her words had shamed the judge, they had enraged others. The story of the armed Apache, the legal paper, and the preacher's wife's defense became fuel for the town's darkest whispers. They were no longer just a shunned woman and a rumor. They were a threat. An Indian had used the white man's law against them. A white woman had chosen a savage over her own kind. It was Silas Croft who fanned the flames. He spoke in the saloon, his words poisoned with whiskey and righteous fury. He spoke of the law being spat upon, of the danger to other women, of the territory falling to red heathens. The proof of their hatred came in the night. Clara woke to a noise, the sound of hoofbeats muffled by the snow. Taza was already out of the bed, the rifle in his hand before his feet touched the floor.
What is it?
She whispered. Stay inside, he ordered. He slipped out the door into the frigid night. Clara ran to the window, wiping the frost from the pane. In the weak moonlight, she saw them. 2 men on horseback, riding away fast, laughing. Taza walked to the barn. He stood there for a long time, just looking. Clara put on her boots and her heaviest shawl and ran to him.
Taza, what is it? What did they do?
He did not speak. He just pointed at the barn door. In crude, dripping black paint, slashed across the wood he had so carefully repaired, were 2 words. Savage lover. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. She felt sick, as if she had been struck. They had come onto her land. They had violated her home. Taza's face was murder. She had seen him calm. She had seen him in pain. She had seen him gentle. She had never seen this. His hands were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He looked in the direction the men had fled, and a low, guttural sound came from his chest. He turned and went back to the cabin. He returned with a bucket of lye soap and a stiff brush. He scrubbed at the paint, but the word savage was stained deep into the wood. 2 nights later, they came back. This time, they painted the side of the cabin itself, right under her window. White whore. Clara found it in the morning. She was the one who scrubbed this time, her tears freezing on her face, her hands raw and bleeding from the lye. She scrubbed until the words were faded, but she could still see them. They were ghosts burned into the wood. That night, she broke. We have to go, she said. She was standing at the stove, her back to him, stirring a thin rabbit stew. No.
Yes, they won't stop. This is my fault. I've made you a target. They'll kill you. Taza, they'll wait until you're hunting, or they'll come in the night when we're sleeping. We have to leave. We can go north, like you said, to the mountains. We can sell the land. I don't care about the land. We can...
No. She turned, her voice rising.
Why not? It's just dirt. It's just wood. I told you, I won't lose you over dirt.
It is not the dirt, he said. He was standing by the hearth, the firelight catching the hard lines of his face. He looked at the shotgun by the door. We do not run. You ran. You ran from your people. You ran from the soldiers. Why is this different?
Because I am done running,
he said. He looked at her. This is home. The word hung in the air between them. Home. He had never had one. She had never had one that was safe. Clara's shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her belly. But something else was there, too. a hard, cold resolve that matched his. She had been a victim for 6 years. She had been a survivor for 2. She would not be a victim again. She walked to the window and looked out at the faded stain on her wall. "This is home," she agreed. "Let them come." They came a week later. It was near midnight, on the dark of the moon. The dog, a half-wild stray Taza, had begun feeding, let out a sharp, choked bark, followed by a sudden yelp of pain, and then silence. "They are here," Taza said. He was already out of the bed, pulling on his boots. The cabin was dark. "How many?" Clara whispered. She was reaching for the shotgun, her hand steady. "More than 2. A flicker of light appeared outside the window. Then another, and another. Torches. "Clara!" He grabbed the new rifle. "Stay away from the window. Load the shotgun. Load it again when it is empty. Do not come out." "Taza, no! You can't fight them alone!" "They want me. They will try to burn the barn first, to draw me out. You will stay here. You will guard the house." He grabbed her, his hands hard on her shoulders. He kissed her, a hard, fast, desperate kiss. "Do not come out." He slipped out the door like a shadow. Clara ran to the side window, her heart choking her. She saw them, 8 of them, 8 men on horseback, their faces masked by shadow, torches held high. Silas Croft was at their head. "Burn the barn," Croft roared. "He's probably in there, sleeping with the animals." 2 men dismounted, running toward the barn with their lit torches. A shot cracked from the darkness by the woodpile. One of the men screamed, dropping his torch, grabbing his leg. "He's there!" a man yelled. "By the wood!" They opened fire. Bullets thudded into the woodpile where Taza was hidden. The sound of splintering wood was terrifying. Clara screamed. She raised the shotgun and fired both barrels through the window, shattering the glass. The shot was wide, spraying buckshot into the night, but it made them scatter, their horses rearing. "She's in the house!" Croft yelled, his voice thick with rage. "Set the cabin alight! Burn them both out! Burn the whore with him!" A man with a torch broke from the group, galloping straight toward the cabin. He was low in the saddle, his face contorted. Taza rose from behind the woodpile, firing the rifle. The man's horse reared, screaming, as the man tumbled from the saddle, his torch sputtering in the snow. But Taza was exposed. Silas Croft, waiting, raised his own rifle. He fired. Taza cried out. It was not a loud sound, but it was sharp, a sound of deep, sudden pain. He staggered, his hand clutching his chest. He dropped his rifle and fell back into the shadows of the woodpile. "No!" Clara shrieked. A cold, white rage, purer and hotter than any fear she had ever known, consumed her. She dropped the empty shotgun, grabbed her husband's heavy axe from the hearth, and threw the cabin door open. She ran out into the snow, screaming, a wild woman with an axe, her hair unbound, her nightdress white against the dark. The vigilantes, brave in a pack, stopped. They saw her, this small woman, running at them with a killing tool, and they hesitated. Another shot cracked, not from Taza, not from Clara. It came from the trail. "Sheriff Brody, in the name of the law, drop your weapons!" It was the sheriff, and with him, 2 deputies, and behind him, on a wagon, holding a lantern high, was Mrs. Gable. She must have seen the torches from her window in town and roused the sheriff. "Croft, you damn fool!" Brody yelled, firing his pistol into the air. The vigilantes scattered like rats. Silas Croft stared, his face a mask of fury, then spurred his horse into the darkness. The sheriff did not chase him. He rode straight to Clara. But Clara was already at the woodpile. "Taza! Taza!" He was slumped against the wood, his hand pressed to his chest. Blood, dark and thick, streamed between his fingers. "He's shot," she whispered, dropping the axe. The sheriff dismounted.
Mrs. Gable, the wagon, now!
They got him inside. Onto the cot, Mrs. Gable, her face grim, tore open his shirt. The bullet had entered high on his chest, near the shoulder.
It's high,
she said, her voice steady.
Pray God it missed his lung. Clara, water, boil it.
The roles were reversed. Taza had been the strong one, the healer of the land. Now, he was as weak as he had been that first night, his life bleeding out onto her floor. Clara nursed him. She boiled the water. She tore the last of her sheets. Mrs. Gable helped her clean the wound and bind it tightly.
He is strong, child, Mrs.
Gable said, her hand on Clara's shoulder.
He will fight.
He fought. For 5 days. He lay in a fever, his body burning. He dreamed, his voice low, speaking words in his own tongue. He dreamed of the rope, of the soldiers, of the battle. Clara never left him. She sat on the floor by the cot, holding his hand, wiping his face with cool cloths, whispering to him.
You stay. Do you hear me? You stay. You are not leaving me.
On the 6th day, the fever broke. He woke. His eyes were clear. He looked at her. He saw the exhaustion on her face, the dark circles under her eyes. He saw the bone ring on her finger. He was weak. He could barely speak. He tried to lift his hand, but could not.
Water,
he rasped. She lifted his head, holding a cup to his lips. He drank. He lay back, his eyes tracing the rafters of the cabin. If I die here, he whispered, his voice a dry scratch.
You are not dying,
she said, her voice fierce.
If I die,
he insisted, his gaze holding hers. Bury me by your garden, where the roots are. He wanted to be part of her land, part of her. Clara's tears fell onto his chest, onto the bandage. She grabbed his hand.
You are not dying,
she said, her voice shaking but full of iron.
Do you understand me? I haven't finished loving you yet.
His fingers, weak, tightened on hers. He closed his eyes and slept, a true, healing sleep. He recovered. It was slow. His massive strength returned ounce by ounce. He sat up. Then he stood, leaning on her. Then he walked. Winter lost its grip. The snow began to recede, melting from the south-facing slopes. The ground, hard as iron, began to soften. The world smelled of mud and wet pine. The air was new. One day in late March, the air was warm. Taza, his arm still in a sling, stood in the open doorway, breathing the new air. Clara came to stand beside him. She held a small cloth sack in her hand. It's time, she said. She walked to the small, fallow patch of earth that was her garden. Taza followed, his step still slow, but steady. She knelt on the damp earth. It was rocky, poor soil, but it was theirs. She opened the sack. Seeds, the few she had saved from the last harvest. Corn, beans, squash. She pressed one into the soil. Taza knelt beside her, his good hand brushing the dark, cold earth. Life continued, scarred by bullets, by hate, by paint on the wood. But it was alive. The thaw had come. She planted the seeds, and he was at her side. The spring was a slow, muddy promise. The garden, which had been a patch of desperate survival, became a place of work and then of pride. Clara, her hands no longer stained with lye but with rich soil, planted the seeds she had saved. Taza, his shoulder healing into a long, silver scar, worked beside her. He had lost much of his strength, and for the first time, he was the one who leaned on her. She was his rock, his anchor, as he learned his own body again. He taught her the Apache way of planting, not in straight, rigid lines as the white settlers did, but in clusters, the 3 sisters, corn for the height, beans to climb the stalks, and squash to shade the ground, its broad leaves keeping the moisture in. It was a community of plants, each one helping the others. They live as one, he told her, his voice still rough from the wound. They are stronger together. Clara watched the garden grow, and for the first time, she saw a reflection of her own life. Months passed. The thaw became a green, vibrant summer. The corn grew as high as Taza's shoulder. Their small flock of chickens doubled, their eggs providing a steady trade. Taza, his strength fully returned, his movements once again fluid and powerful, built a new, solid smokehouse. He hunted, but not with the desperation of winter. He hunted for provision, for choice. They cured the venison, and the smell of hickory smoke was a constant, comforting presence. The ranch, once a place of isolation and fear, began to thrive. It was a modest thriving, a hard-won peace, but it was real. They had food in the cellar, they had a strong roof, they had each other. The town, which had been a solid wall of hate, began to crack. The change was not loud. It was not an apology. It was a slow, quiet turning, like a sunflower following the sun. The first sign was a sack of flour. Clara had ridden to the mercantile, her small pouch of coins ready, expecting the cold shoulder from Mr. Hemlock. He had seen her, nodded curtly, and gone into the back. When he returned, he carried a 50-pound sack. That's too much. Clara said, I only have enough for 10 pounds. Got a surplus, Hemlock muttered, not looking at her. He placed it on the counter. Flower moths got into a few. This one's fine. Just take it, my loss. He wouldn't take her money. Clara stared at him, at this man who had let her nearly starve. He was pale, and he looked tired. She knew it was a lie. It was an apology, wrapped in the clumsy paper of a merchant's pride. Thank you, Mr. Hemlock, she said. He just grunted and turned away. A week later, Taza found a new, gleaming axe head resting on the stump of the woodpile. Not a used one, but a new one, sharp and oiled. He picked it up. He knew the blacksmith's mark. He said nothing, but that day, he chopped wood with a renewed vigor. Respect. It had come not from their compliance, but from their defiance. In July, Mrs. Gable's buggy appeared on the trail. Clara's heart, now trained to see visitors as a threat, gave a familiar leap of fear. Taza stepped out onto the porch, his arms crossed over his chest. He was not reaching for his rifle, but he was a wall of muscle, a silent guardian. Mrs. Gable pulled the buggy to a halt. She looked different. Not just the preacher's wife. She looked like a woman on a mission. She climbed down, holding a small tin. Clara, she said, her voice clear in the summer air. Mr. Taza. She used his name. It was the first time Clara had ever heard one of the townsfolk say it. Mrs. Gable, Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron. Please, come in, out of the sun. The cabin was clean. A vase of wild yellow flowers sat on the table. Taza's carving of a hawk sat on the mantel. It smelled of baking bread and dried sage. It was a home. Mrs. Gable sat at the table. She placed the tin in the center. It's coffee, she said, real coffee. From St. Louis, I thought you might enjoy a taste of it. Clara's hands trembled. Coffee? She hadn't tasted it in over a year. She prepared it with the reverence of a sacrament. They sat, the three of them, in the quiet cabin. Sheriff Brody arrested Silas Croft, Mrs. Gable said, looking into her cup. The night of the fire, he was charged with incitement to riot and attempted murder. His ranch has been seized by the territory. He will not be coming back. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It was over. That part, at least. I came today, Mrs. Gable continued, to apologize. Not for the town. Their hearts are their own to mend.
I came to apologize for myself. I stood in judgment of you, Clara. For years, I mistook your endurance for weakness. I was wrong." She looked around the room, at the mended curtains, at the clean floor, at Taza, who sat in the corner, quiet, his presence filling the room with a sense of calm, solid strength. "You have built a life here," Mrs. Gable said, her voice soft. "Not just a homestead, a life, in the face of all of us. I told the women in my sewing circle. I told them, that is a woman worth following. You stayed, you endured, and you chose well." She looked at Taza, a direct, respectful gaze. "He is a good man. Clara, the town is slow, but they see the fences. They see the smoke from your chimney. They see a home, and they are beginning to respect it." Clara had no words. She just nodded, her throat tight, and sipped the hot, strong, bitter coffee. It tasted like forgiveness. In August, another wagon came. This one was different. It was painted with bright letters. Alistair Finch, photographic artist, portraits of the West. A small, wiry man with spectacles and a quick, bird-like energy hopped down. He saw Taza first, who was mending the corral, his bare back gleaming with sweat. "Mr. Finch stopped, his mouth open. "Magnificent," he breathed. He hurried over, his hand outstretched. "Sir, Mr. Alistair Finch, I am documenting the inhabitants of this wild and glorious territory. My goodness, you are a perfect specimen, the noble native." Taza just looked at him, his face impassive. Clara came out. "Can we help you, sir?" "Madam!" Mr. Finch swept his hat off. "1,000 apologies. I am a photographer. I capture life. I make moments last forever. I would be honored, deeply honored, to take a portrait of you and your husband." Clara looked at Taza. A portrait, a record, something that said we were here. She thought of her mother's face, a memory that was fading like old cloth. She had no picture. We don't have much money," Clara said. "Madam, it would be my privilege, no charge. The portrait, the sheer power of it, that will be my payment." "I want to," Clara said to Taza. He looked at her, at the quiet yearning on her face. He nodded once. "It is good to be seen." Clara went inside. She put on her best dress. It was a simple blue wool, the one she had married her first husband in, but she had resewn it, taken the stiffness out of it, and it fit her. She brushed her hair until it shone, and she wore the bone ring Taza had carved. She came out. Taza was waiting. He had put on a clean shirt she had made for him from a bolt of canvas. His long black hair was tied back with a simple leather thong. He was not a noble savage. He was a man. Her man. "Splendid, Mr. Finch bustled. He set up his large, boxy camera on its tripod. He disappeared under the black cloth. "Now, stand close, very close, sir. Place your hand on her shoulder." Taza hesitated. "No," Clara said, her voice quiet. She stepped to his side, and she placed her hand on his arm. His muscle was like stone under her palm. She looked at the camera. Taza stood beside her, his head high. He looked straight ahead, his gaze fixed on the horizon, a look of quiet, unassailable pride. "Hold still," Mr. Finch called out. "For 10 seconds. Do not move. Now!" There was a bright, sudden flash, a puff of white smoke, and a loud pop. They were captured. A settler woman, her face marked by hardship but strong, her hand resting on the arm of a tall Apache man, whose gaze challenged the world. They were united, frozen in time, a testament of bone and will. As he was packing his equipment, Mr. Finch shared the news. "It's all changing, you know," he said, wiping his spectacles. "A new governor in Santa Fe, a hard man,
A federal man. He's enforcing the law, cleaning up the territory. They say he's pushing for statehood. They're recognizing all land claims, all unions, even mixed ones. They want to build a stronger state. They need citizens. They need stability. Clara and Taza looked at each other. The flimsy paper from Judge Miller, the one born of shame and force. It was becoming law. They were, in the eyes of the world, truly, legally, one. The proof of this new world came in September, when the aspen trees on the high mountains were turning to flame. Another rider came, another letter. But this one was not a threat. It was a business proposal, on thick, cream-colored paper, from the Santa Fe Land and Railroad Office. Dear Mrs. Bel Taza, it began. Clara's hand shook. They had used his name. The letter spoke of a potential railroad survey. It spoke of the value of land with water rights. It made an offer. We are prepared to offer the sum of $1,000 in gold coin for your 90-acre patent. Clara sat at the table, the paper in her hand. $1,000. A fortune. Enough to leave this place forever. Enough to go to California, to Oregon. Enough to buy a new life, a green life, a life without the ghosts of paint on the barn wall, without the memory of bullets in the snow. Taza came in from the barn. He saw the letter. He saw her face. What is it? An offer, she whispered. For the land, $1,000. He was silent. He sat across from her. He picked up the letter. He could read the numbers. He could read the words $1,000. He looked at her. He, who had given her his pledge, his protection, his name. He was offering her one last thing, a choice, an escape. We could go, he said, his voice quiet. A new place, a place with many trees, with good water, a place where no one knows us. Clara looked at him. She saw the love in his eyes. He was willing to walk away from this, the first home he had ever built. For her. She stood up. She walked out of the cabin, onto the porch he had built. She looked at her garden, heavy with the harvest. She looked at the barn, its wood scarred but strong. She looked at the faint, faded stain under her window, the ghost of the word whore. She looked at the mountains, purple in the late afternoon light. She touched the bone ring on her finger. She had been running her entire life. She had been running from her husband, from the town, from hunger, from fear. She was done running. She went back inside. Taza was watching her, his face taut. She walked to the table. She folded the letter. This land saw our pain, she said, her voice clear and strong. It saw us when we were starving, and when we were bleeding, and when we were so lonely, we were ghosts. She met his eyes. It deserves our joy, too. He did not smile. His face, it relaxed. The tension left him. He reached across the table and took her hand. Then we stay. The final scene of their struggle ended not with a bang, but with a quiet evening. Weeks later, the harvest was in. The root cellar was full. The smokehouse was stocked. Winter was coming, but this time they were ready for it. They sat on the porch, side by side in the cool twilight. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and the coming cold. The coyotes sang from the ridges, but it was not a sound of hunger. It was just a song. Taza had been quiet all evening. He sat beside her, his solid presence a comfort. He took her hand. It was no longer soft, but it was strong. He looked at the calluses on her palm, and he lifted it to his lips, kissing the center. He kept her hand, his thumb stroking the bone ring. He leaned in. She felt the warmth of his breath on her neck. He kissed the skin just behind her ear, a slow, warm kiss that made her shiver. I still want you, he whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. Like the first night, when I was dying in the snow, before I knew your words. I wanted you then. Clara's breath hitched. She turned to look at him. His black eyes were full of a deep, settled fire. It was not the desperate need of the barn. It was the fierce, complete want of a man for his wife. She said nothing. She just stood and held out her hand to him. He took it. They went inside. He did not bar the door. They did not need to. They stood by the hearth, the fire crackling, casting warm, dancing shadows on the walls. He took the pins from her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders. She unlaced the ties of his shirt, her fingers tracing the silver scar on his chest. They came together not as strangers needing warmth, but as a man and a woman choosing each other, fiercely, completely. Later, she lay against his chest, her head over his heart, their bodies tangled in the blankets of their cot. The fire was low. The wind outside had picked up, but it was just wind. It could not get in. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, solid beat of his heart under her ear. She felt a word she had never known: peace. "I didn't think I'd ever want to live again," she whispered into his skin. "For so long, I was just not dying." He held her tighter, his arms a fortress around her. His hand stroked her hair. He was silent for a long time, and she thought he had fallen asleep. "You don't just live anymore," he replied, his voice deep and sure in the quiet room. "You're loved." Thank you for listening to this story. We truly hope you enjoyed this journey across the high, lonesome plains of the New Mexico Territory. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and let us know what part of the world you're in. For more tales of survival, love, and the raw heart of the frontier, please be sure to subscribe to From Wild West. And finally, we value your thoughts. What did you think of Clara and Taza's story? Share your feelings in English in the comments below. We read every single one. Thank you again